Berlin, December 12, 1944. In a cramped office beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hauptmann Ernst Weber sits before a mountain of telegrams, each one containing a name, a unit designation, a date, and a single word that will shatter a family. Gefallen, fallen. His job for the past 3 years has been to process these casualty notifications, to ensure that every German family learns the fate of their sons through the Wehrmacht's sophisticated communication system, a marvel of Prussian efficiency that once prided itself on notifying families within days of a soldier's death. But the system is breaking. Weber can see it in the growing stacks of unprocessed notifications, in the telegrams arriving weeks or months after the deaths they report, in the desperate letters from families begging for information about sons who vanished months ago with no word. He holds a telegram dated November 3rd, reporting the death of a soldier who was killed on September 12th. It has taken 2 months to reach his desk, and it will take another week to reach the family, if it reaches them at all. Many addresses listed are in cities that no longer exist, bombed into rubble, their residents scattered or dead. Weber knows something that the regime will never officially acknowledge: the casualty reporting system, the technological and bureaucratic marvel designed to maintain morale by giving families closure, has collapsed under the weight of losses too massive to process, too catastrophic to admit. December 12, 1944 was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of thousands of small failures, each one representing a family that would never know when or how their son died, a mother waiting at a window for a telegram that would never arrive, a father checking the mail every day for years, hoping for news that had been lost in the chaos of a dying regime. This is the story of how technology designed to humanize war, to give meaning and closure to sacrifice, became the instrument of prolonged agony when it failed, and how an entire generation of German families was left to grieve in uncertainty, not knowing if their sons were dead, captured, missing, or simply erased by a system that could no longer cope with the scale of death it had unleashed. By December 1944, German military casualties had exceeded 5 million dead, with hundreds of thousands more missing. The casualty reporting system was processing notifications at less than half the rate that deaths were occurring. More than 60% of families whose sons had died in the final 6 months of 1944 would not receive official notification until after the war ended, and some never received notification at all. How does a nation build a system to communicate death? What happens when that system, designed with Prussian precision and technological sophistication, encounters losses so catastrophic that it simply stops functioning? And what is the psychological cost to families left in liminal space, not knowing, unable to grieve, suspended between hope and despair for months or years? To understand how the Wehrmacht's casualty notification system became both a technological achievement and a source of immense psychological suffering, we must travel back to the 1920s and the German military's obsession with learning from the First World War. After Germany's defeat in 1918, military planners conducted extensive analyses of what had gone wrong. One consistent finding was that home front morale had collapsed, partly because families received either no information or contradictory information about the fates of soldiers. Rumors spread faster than facts. Families tormented by uncertainty became breeding grounds for defeatism and resentment toward military leadership. The lesson was clear: any future war would require a systematic, efficient method of notifying families about casualties to maintain morale and trust in the regime. Enter Ernst Weber, born in 1911 in Munich to a family of civil servants. His father had worked in the Bavarian postal system, instilling in young Ernst an appreciation for systematic organization and the power of communication infrastructure. Weber studied administrative science at university, graduating in 1933, the year Hitler came to power. Like many young Germans of his generation, Weber was not initially a fervent Nazi, but rather a technocrat, someone who believed in efficiency, order, and the power of well-designed systems to solve complex problems. When he was recruited into the Wehrmacht Administrative Corps in 1935, his expertise in communication systems and bureaucratic organization made him perfect for a new initiative, designing a comprehensive casualty, reporting and notification system that would function even under the stress of total war. The system Weber helped develop was genuinely innovative for its time, combining traditional postal infrastructure with cutting-edge communication technology. At its heart were Fernschreibstelle, teleprinter offices, located in major cities across Germany. These offices used Siemens teleprinters, sophisticated electromechanical devices that could transmit text over telephone lines at speeds far exceeding traditional telegraph. A field unit reporting casualties would send information to a regional collection center, which would compile reports and transmit them via teleprinter to central offices in Berlin and Königsberg. There, clerks like Weber would process the information, cross-reference it with personnel records to ensure accuracy, and generate notification telegrams to be delivered to families. The system included redundancy, with units maintaining their own casualty logs, medical facilities reporting separately, and even chaplains filing independent reports. This multi-layered approach was designed to ensure that even if communication lines were disrupted, casualties would still eventually be reported through alternate channels. The Wehrmacht invested heavily in this infrastructure, recognizing that maintaining home front morale required not just propaganda, but also trustworthy information about individual fates. Families needed to know, even if the news was terrible, because uncertainty was worse than confirmed death. The first tests of the system came during the early years of the war, from 1939 through 1941. Casualties in Poland were relatively light, and the system performed flawlessly. Families received telegrams within 3 to 5 days of a soldier's death, formatted with bureaucratic precision. The soldier's name, rank, unit, date of death, location if possible, and a brief statement about burial or disposition of remains. The campaigns in France and the Low Countries in 1940 produced more casualties, but the system still coped well. Reports filtered back to Weber and his colleagues that families, while devastated by the loss, appreciated the quick notification and the detailed information provided. This reinforced their belief that they had designed something humane, something that honored sacrifice by ensuring families could grieve with knowledge rather than torture themselves with uncertainty. But then came Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, and everything changed. The scale of the Eastern Front dwarfed anything the system had been designed to handle. In the first 6 months of Barbarossa, German casualties exceeded 700,000, more than all previous campaigns combined. The field reporting system began to strain almost immediately. Units engaged in constant combat had no time for meticulous record-keeping. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, processing wounded and dying men faster than paperwork could be completed. Worst of all, communication infrastructure across vast stretches of the Soviet Union was primitive or non-existent, meaning that even when units filed casualty reports, those reports might sit in a field post office for weeks before making their way back to Germany. Weber first noticed the problems in September 1941, when the backlog of unprocessed notifications in his office exceeded 1,000 telegrams. His team worked overtime, processing notifications as fast as possible, but more kept arriving. The multi-layered redundancy built into the system, designed to prevent losses from falling through cracks, now created duplication and confusion. The same soldier might be reported as wounded by his unit, as missing by a field hospital, and as dead by a chaplain, with reports arriving weeks apart. Weber's team had to cross-reference everything, a process that took time while families waited. The winter of 1941-42 was catastrophic. German forces, unprepared for the brutal Soviet winter, suffered horrific casualties from combat, frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. Entire units were encircled and destroyed. Communication lines froze or were cut by Soviet forces. Field post offices were overrun or abandoned. Casualty reports that should have taken days to reach Berlin took weeks or months. Some never arrived at all. Weber spent that winter processing notifications for soldiers who had died in October and November, knowing that more recent deaths were piling up in the system, creating a growing gap between when men died and when families learned of it. This gap was not just an administrative inconvenience, it was psychological torture for families who wrote letters to sons who were already dead, who hoped for responses that would never come, who spent weeks or months in agonizing uncertainty. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, broke the system's back in ways it never fully recovered from. The German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, was encircled in November 1942. For 2 months, as the situation deteriorated, the encircled forces continued filing casualty reports via radio when possible, but the chaos of the pocket meant reports were incomplete, delayed, or lost entirely. When the pocket finally collapsed in February 1943, 91,000 survivors were captured, and the rest, over 200,000 men, were dead or missing. The casualties occurred over such a compressed period and in such chaotic circumstances that the reporting system simply couldn't process them. Weber and his colleagues worked around the clock throughout March and April 1943, processing Stalingrad notifications, but even months later, tens of thousands of families still hadn't been officially notified. Some families first learned their sons had died at Stalingrad, not from official telegrams but from rumors, from returned wounded soldiers, from foreign radio broadcasts. The regime tried to suppress this information flow, but it was impossible. The erosion of trust in the official system had begun. Families started to believe that official telegrams were delayed or inaccurate, that they couldn't rely on the Wehrmacht to tell them the truth about their sons' fates. Weber himself struggled with a growing moral dilemma. He had designed his career around the belief that efficient systems could serve humanitarian purposes, that his work processing death notifications was helping families achieve closure and honor their sons' sacrifices. But by mid-1943, he was forced to confront the reality that the system was failing, that his work was contributing to prolonged suffering rather than alleviating it. He raised concerns with superiors, suggesting that they needed more personnel, better equipment, streamlined procedures to reduce the backlog. His suggestions were acknowledged but rarely implemented. The regime's priority was maintaining the fiction that everything was under control, that the system was working, even as evidence mounted that it was not. The Allied bombing campaign against German cities added another layer of complexity and tragedy to the notification system. The addresses to which telegrams were supposed to be delivered were increasingly in cities that had been partially or completely destroyed. Postal workers attempting to deliver death notifications found themselves navigating rubble, searching for families who might have been killed in the same raids or evacuated to unknown locations. The Reichspost, Germany's postal service, tried to maintain forwarding information for evacuated families, but the scale of displacement overwhelmed this effort. By late 1943, an estimated 20% of casualty notifications were undeliverable due to address problems, adding to the backlog as Weber's team tried to track down correct addresses through alternate channels, a process that could take months. The summer of 1944 brought a new catastrophe, Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center and killed or captured over 400,000 German soldiers in a matter of weeks. The notification system had no hope of keeping pace. Reports from the Eastern Front became increasingly sporadic and incomplete as German forces retreated in chaos. Units that had maintained meticulous records for years simply abandoned record-keeping in the rush to survive. Soldiers listed as missing might be dead, captured, or have deserted. There was no way to know, no system capable of determining individual fates when entire armies were disintegrating. Weber processed what notifications he could, but he knew the information was inadequate, that he was sending telegrams reporting soldiers as missing when those soldiers were almost certainly dead, but without confirmation. The official status remained uncertain. This created a particular cruelty for families. The notification that a son was missing offered a sliver of hope. Perhaps he was alive somewhere. Perhaps he'd been captured and would return after the war. Families clung to this hope, and who could blame them? But Weber knew the statistics. More than 80% of soldiers reported missing on the Eastern Front in 1944 were dead. He was giving families false hope through bureaucratic necessity, and it haunted him. By December 1944, the situation had become completely untenable. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, Germany's last desperate offensive that would produce tens of thousands more casualties that the system had no capacity to process. The Eastern Front was collapsing, with Soviet forces advancing toward Germany itself. The Western Front was being pushed back toward the Rhine. German forces were encircled in pockets across Europe, cut off from communication, their fates unknown. And in Weber's office in Berlin, the backlog of unprocessed casualty notifications had grown to over 50,000. December 12, 1944, was the day Weber realized with absolute clarity that the system had failed irretrievably. A telegram crossed his desk that morning, reporting the death of a soldier on June 3, 1944, more than 6 months earlier. The soldier had been killed during the defense of Rome. His unit had filed a casualty report in early June. That report had been sent to a regional collection center in northern Italy. That center had been evacuated in July as Allied forces advanced. The records were packed and shipped, lost for 2 months, finally recovered in September, processed in October, and transmitted to Berlin in November. Weber received it on December 12th and would process it that day. The notification telegram would be sent to the family on December 13th, arriving probably on December 15th. 6 months and 12 days after the soldier's death, his mother would learn that her son was gone, and this was one of the successful cases where the notification eventually arrived. Weber knew that thousands of others were simply lost, that the families of those soldiers would wait months, years, perhaps forever, for news that would never come. The psychological impact of the notification system's collapse on German families was profound and has been understudied by historians focused on military or political aspects of the war. For families, the wait for information became a form of torture. Hope and despair alternated in agonizing cycles. A family might go months without hearing from a son at the front, anxiety building daily, then receive a letter dated weeks earlier, temporarily relieving the fear, only to return to silence and renewed worry. When weeks turned to months without communication, families faced impossible questions. Should they assume the worst? Should they continue hoping? How long do you wait before grief becomes permissible? The arrival of the telegram was a moment of crystallized horror, even when expected. The distinctive format of the Wehrmacht casualty telegram meant that postal workers delivering them knew what they contained, and families who saw the telegram boy approaching their door knew what was coming. Some families later reported that the seconds between seeing the telegram boy and actually receiving the telegram were the worst of their lives, a moment of pure, concentrated dread before confirmation arrived. But for many families, the telegram never came, or came so late that they'd already learned of the death through other means, creating anger and resentment toward a system that had failed them. Others received telegrams reporting their sons as missing, which created a different kind of agony, the inability to grieve because hope, however slim, remained. Decades after the war, researchers studying post-traumatic stress in civilian populations found that German families who never received definitive notification of their sons' deaths showed higher rates of complicated grief and depression compared to families who received timely notification, even though both groups had lost sons. The uncertainty itself was traumatizing, preventing psychological closure and leaving families in perpetual liminal states. The cultural impact of the notification system's failure extended beyond individual families to shape post-war German society. The concept of the missing, soldiers whose fates were never definitively determined, became a cultural obsession. Organizations were established after the war to search for missing soldiers, to compile records, to give families answers that the Wehrmacht's system had failed to provide. The Deutsche Dienststelle, established in 1939 as the Wehrmacht's information office for casualties and prisoners of war, continued operating after the war specifically to address this backlog, processing inquiries and researching fates for decades. Some families didn't receive definitive information about their sons' deaths until the 1950s or even 1960s, 15 to 20 years after the deaths occurred. This prolonged uncertainty shaped German cultural memory of the war, creating a collective sense of unresolved grief that permeated society. The failure of the notification system also contributed to the erosion of trust in authority that characterized post-war Germany. If the Wehrmacht, with all its vaunted efficiency and organization, couldn't even manage to notify families about casualties in a timely manner, what else had it lied about or failed at? This realization opened space for broader questioning of the Nazi regime's competence and honesty, questioning that might not have occurred if the system had functioned as designed. In this sense, the technological failure of the casualty notification system had political and cultural ramifications, contributing to the psychological conditions that allowed West Germany to eventually confront its past, rather than romanticizing the Wehrmacht as it might have if military institutions had maintained credibility. Weber himself survived the war. As Soviet forces approached Berlin in April 1945, he destroyed records to prevent them falling into enemy hands, a decision that would later complicate efforts to account for missing soldiers. He was captured, spent 2 years in a Soviet POW camp, and returned to Germany in 1947. He never worked in government administration again, instead becoming a postal clerk in Hamburg, a quiet job with no responsibility for matters of life and death. He rarely spoke about his wartime work, carrying guilt that while he hadn't caused any deaths directly, his failure to make the notification system work properly had prolonged the suffering of thousands of families. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, Weber reflected on the fundamental flaw in the system he'd helped design. It assumed that war would remain bounded, that casualties would remain manageable, that infrastructure would remain intact. The system was designed for a limited war, but World War II on the Eastern Front was total war, consuming everything, including the administrative structures meant to humanize it. The legacy of the Wehrmacht casualty notification system's failure influenced how militaries thought about casualty reporting and family notification in subsequent conflicts. The United States military, studying the German experience, implemented protocols during the Vietnam War requiring personal notification of next of kin by uniformed personnel rather than impersonal telegrams, recognizing that how families learn of deaths matters as much as the fact of death itself. Modern military casualty notification systems emphasize speed, accuracy, dignity, and personal contact, all lessons derived partly from studying how the Wehrmacht system failed. The psychological and cultural understanding of grief also evolved partly in response to the German experience. The concept of ambiguous loss, grief without closure when death isn't confirmed, was developed by researchers studying families of missing soldiers from World War II. This research revealed that humans need certainty to grieve effectively, that hope, while seemingly positive, can become psychologically destructive when it prevents acceptance and healing. These insights now inform how military and psychological services handle cases of missing service members, with efforts made to provide families with definitive information as quickly as possible, even when that information is terrible. December 12, 1944, stands as a symbolic date, not because anything specific happened that day, but because it represents the moment when the accumulation of failures became undeniable, when the gap between the system's design and its reality could no longer be ignored or papered over with propaganda. For Hauptmann Weber, sitting in his Berlin office processing 6-month-old casualty notifications, while knowing that thousands more recent deaths remained unreported, it was the day he acknowledged that the humanitarian impulse behind the system, the desire to give families closure and honor sacrifice, had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of death the regime had unleashed. For families across Germany, waiting for news that was months delayed or would never come, it was one of countless days spent in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing if this would be the day the telegram arrived, if their sons were dead or alive, if they should grieve or hope. The men who died at the front experienced their own forms of suffering, but their families experienced a different kind of psychological warfare, the torture of not knowing, prolonged by a technological system designed to help, but which collapsed under the weight of catastrophic losses. The story of the Wehrmacht casualty notification system is a story about the limits of technology and bureaucracy when confronted with the chaos and scale of total war, about how systems designed with humanitarian intentions can become instruments of suffering when they fail, and about the psychological costs of uncertainty that extend far beyond battlefields. It reminds us that in war, the living suffer in ways that are less visible, but no less real than those who die, and that the families left behind carry burdens that shape generations. Understanding this history doesn't create moral equivalence between Nazi Germany and its victims, doesn't diminish German responsibility for starting a war of aggression and committing genocide, but it does illuminate the full spectrum of suffering that war creates, including suffering among the families of the aggressor nation, suffering that was itself a consequence of decisions made by a regime that valued conquest over human life. If your family has stories from this period, from any nation, about waiting for news from the front, about the arrival of casualty notifications, about living with uncertainty about loved ones' fates, please share those stories in the comments below. These personal histories are vital parts of understanding the full human cost of war that statistics alone can never capture. If this exploration of the psychological and technological dimensions of World War II resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more detailed examinations of the hidden human stories behind major historical events, and click the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes where we'll explore similar themes from different perspectives and conflicts, because understanding how war affects not just soldiers, but families, communities, and entire societies makes us wiser. about the true costs of conflict and more thoughtful about when and how we choose to wage war. Thank you for watching.